Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again for another live edition of Everything Compliance. We're absolutely thrilled today to have Susan Divers join us. Susan, first of all, welcome to Everything Compliance,
Thanks, Tom. I'm delighted to be here.
joined by our regular panelists Matt Kelly, Karen Moore, and Jonathan Marks. Mr. Armstrong and the professor are on assignment today. We're going to take up the 2024 ECCP as our general topic. And I'm going to ask Susan to give us her thoughts because she has one of the most unique takes I've heard about this. So, Susan, what did you see either new, different, or an evolution of the DOJ's thinking in the 2024 evaluation of corporate compliance programs?
Sure, Tom. Of course, I read it 3 or 4 times and then read a lot of the analysis about it. But one thing I did not see in the analysis, which I think is absolutely fundamental, is, and I'll read the quote first from the ECCP update. Um, it states in the introduction, prosecutors, in short, should examine whether the compliance program is being disseminated to and understood by employees in practice in order to decide whether the compliance program is truly effective. I- In the thinking about that, what they're really saying is stop focusing so much on inputs and start focusing on outputs. And if you sort of have that as your framework, you can find that in lots of places in the updates. One of them is training. And they've said things like this before, but they added that training has to be tailored specifically to particular needs, interests, and values of relevant employees. Values is sort of new, but I think that's a good addition in that the way you train people in San Antonio may not be the way that you train them in Kuala Lumpur, and hopefully not. You want to localize to the degree that is possible. And of course, you have to take into account industry and geographic region. It's also in the reporting section on whistleblowing, where it asks whether you're incentivizing reporting and whether the organization trains employees on both the internal mechanism and the external resources that are now available. And it's definitely in the policy and procedures section where the questions are whether the company has communicated its policies and procedures to all employees and whether the company can confirm that the employees know how to access relevant policies. So, why am I all focused on this? In the many years I've been in this space, I think most of the reporting that E&C programs do to the board or to the C suite, and I plead guilty when I was in house, is about activities and inputs rather than outputs. So, a typical report will say we trained 10,000 people last year or last quarter. We had X number of hotline complaints. We rolled out X number of policy updates, and maybe we refreshed our code of conduct. But when you think about it, that's all input data. And what DOJ, and I've seen this in other iterations of the guidance, what DOJ is here is okay, we're beyond the stage where people know that they have to have in place codes of conduct, training, policies. What we want to know now, if you come in and you're going to have one of those really awkward conversations with us as to why you shouldn't be fined, is what is your output from your program? You may have trained 10,000 people, but the training may have gone completely over their heads or been in a really hard to understand or not particularly relevant to what they do. So that obviously ties into the focus on data analytics. But why don't I stop there with that sort of framework laid out? And by the way, I will say it's something that I've been tracking in my research for probably since at least 2020 that programs are starting to get this and they're much more focused on the employee experience rather than just pushing content.
Well, Susan, I would just ask, do you think this is an evolution in the DOJ's thinking? Do you think this is because companies who've been in enforcement actions have come forward and said, we have evolved in our thinking and this is what we've done, and the DOJ has adopted it? Or maybe something, either all of the above or different?
I think it's probably all of the above. I know from friends in the fraud section over the years that the guidance frequently represents frustration that the fraud section has when people come in. And for example, I'd say 10 years ago, people were talking much too much about gifts and entertainment. We've got policies and procedures in place so that nobody can buy anybody a coffee. And so DOJ says, let's focus on the big things and the real risks. So I think it is something that has started to evolve. You can see it in the March 2023 guidance too. I think it's mostly that people are still stuck in the sort of reporting on inputs mode and not enough on the outcomes mode.
Mr. Marks, do you have a comment or question for us? You're on mute.
That's probably on purpose. Susan, once you get to know me, you'll realize that was done on purpose.
I'm so flattered that I made you speechless that I can, barely stand up.
Then you really don't know me.
Touche.
Yeah, no, that's good. So it's funny when this came out, I was running all over the place and I was on a train and Tom and I and Matt Matt, there were some text messages going back and forth or whatever. So I got a chance to reread it a couple times, probably like yourself. It's my, I like what you're saying, but I'm kind of cautionary to that because I do think that a lot of times we tend to read into certain things. And I'll tell you what my read in was here. But I think that the blocking and tackling stuff is still not being done properly. And I'll explain why. And those are the inputs, right? So the risk assessments, I'm still seeing companies that struggle even fundamentally in coming up with a risk assessment that is actually meaningful, that not only includes the enterprise, but the extended enterprise. The compliance program design, I still see companies struggling with that, how companies set up and revise their policies, procedures, and internal controls to mitigate these particular risks that should fall out from that risk assessment. The training and communication stuff that you're talking about, ensuring the employees understand the program through tailored training, I completely and totally agree. If I walk into a training session and Tom and Matt and probably Karen has heard me say this a gazillion times, and somebody starts by the 19 Corrupt Practices Act was enacted in 1977, I walk out the door. I'm a firm believer on training with regards to red flags. Tell me what I need to know and what I need to recognize. So for that, I really do think you hit on something that's very pertinent there for a bunch of different reasons. Commitment and resources is another input that I keep thinking about. Allocating resources and demonstrating management's commitment to that ethical compliance. And then the last thing I think from an input, that just the big things that I keep thinking about are competent, like the ethical reporting systems, like encouraging our employees to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. Those to me would be some sort of the key, and I'm sure we can go on with many more key inputs. The outputs to me were essentially the effectiveness and the real world impact. For example, our program effectiveness, whether the compliance program is really deterring, detecting, and addressing misconduct. These are things that sometimes I don't think are being talked about. Continuous improvement. We talk about communication, a sender, a medium, and a receiver. But, if you notice, and you probably have, the big thing that it's always missing is that feedback loop, and the ECCP and the other guidance that has come out, not only by the DOJ and the SEC, but others have really accentuated on all of that, that you really do need that feedback mechanism to kind of drive that continuous improvement. And it can't be a set it and forget it activity. It has to be something that's really ongoing.
Hey, but Jonathan, I'm going to reply to one thing you said. I agree with you that there are certainly companies out there that have codes of conduct that can barely be read or don't do risk assessments well. But I think we're saying the same thing. If you look at a risk assessment and no matter who did it and you missed a big risk, that's an output. And that's something that they will really focus in on. And a good example is, sorry, the March 23 guidance talked about off channel communications and bring your own device to work. nobody paid attention to that. That should have gone into their risk assessment. Nobody, but over 100 companies have been fined. And when I did a rough calculation, there have been $4 billion worth of fines by the SEC since then. So that should have gone in to everybody's risk assessment, because then the output was failure. So I think we're saying the same thing in a lot of ways, but I think you have to really look at the end result to really evaluate whether your program is effective.
Yeah, I'm not that again, maybe I see it a little bit differently, but we might be saying the same thing, but from a logic perspective, I kind of break it out and unpack it in the way that I'm trying to articulate this. For example, remediation is an output to me too. How the company corrects issues and prevents future misconduct. Are we getting to the root cause? These are some of the things that I think are not being done effectively. So while there's definite inputs and there's outputs, I didn't, and you may have these special powers. I looked at more the tone of the document rather than sort of these hidden meetings, that a lot of people keep talking about. And I'm not saying that you're saying that, but for example, one of the things that I keep talking to everybody about is that there's a huge emphasis on tailored compliance, that what works for IBM doesn't work for another company. I think that's one of those things that if you really read this document, that's what they're saying. Continuous improvement and data driven adjustments with all the data that we see. And again, to me, that data is really the silent communicator and could be the silent whistleblower for certain things. And then the last thing to me was, which I think sort of hasn't really been talked about for many years, it's been mentioned, but it goes back to tone at the top and culture of the organization. So to me, I don't think for me, and it's just my opinion, I don't know that the document really carries any hidden meaning to me. I looked at these couple of things that I mentioned as sort of the reading between the lines, so to speak, but not really. I think they're trying hard to come up with something like when you go back to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, that was probably a shot across the bow that, everyone needs to have good internal controls. And while they talk about Fiducia 112 being the forerunner to certain things, I think the FCPA was a forerunner with Fiducia 112 into Sarbanes-Oxley. This may be the forerunner into something else from a compliance perspective. But I do like your insights and what you're getting at. I just think it needs to be more developed. And for me, from a practitioner's perspective, I tend to think of it in sort of this logical form. That's just me.
Fair enough. I don't think it's a hidden meaning. I think it's obvious, but I'll let it go with that.
All right, Matt, you have looked at this from a variety of angles, but I think you wanted to explore the AI angle with us today.
I did. And in fact, my thoughts about the artificial intelligence elements from these updates, it probably dovetails rather nicely with Susan, your broad point that these updates want companies to think more about outcomes. I do agree with that. And I was struck about what the compliance guidelines now say around artificial intelligence and also what a somewhat overlooked second speech by the head of the criminal division, Nicole Argentieri. Earlier this week, she gave a speech to basically a bunch of computer crime specialists where she talked more specifically about what the Justice Department would like companies to do when thinking about AI risks. And I tie this back to Susan's point about outcomes because honestly, I don't know that it's quite clear for companies yet. What are the special things, the inputs, or the exact compliance activities we need to implement to address our AI risks? Because we don't know. AI is still so new that we're not entirely sure what an AI risk is. We can venture us some good examples, but step back and think about it. A business would need to think through what are the AI risks that my company creates? How am I using AI? Are we developing AI and then selling it to third parties? Are we using AI systems developed by another company for our own operations? So that's one way to think about your intersection with AI systems. But also, what are other people's uses of AI? Read that as scammers, fraudsters, cyber attackers. How are they using AI to come after my business? So you have risks that are, I'll say, are inward generated, facing outward. How are we using AI and what are we doing to introduce AI risks out into the world? And what are external AI risks coming at us? And the guidance basically says you have to think about all of that. If you are building a new AI system that potentially could be used to be weaponized in some way, you're coming up with a really clever generative AI tool. Could ne'er do wells out there take the tool that you're selling or offering and use it to create false documentation so that they could then run scams against other businesses? You would have to think about that. And are you introducing some sort of new risk that therefore you, the company, should be putting some guardrails around it? What about if you are using an AI system to automate something, or you're using an AI system to run your own, you've developed your own AI system to decide who's going to get credit decisions at my business? And what product recommendations are we going to get? What prices are we going to set for customers? It's no secret that AI could wind up discriminating against those customers that you have. How are you making sure that the AI you're using won't do that? Whether you have developed that system yourself, whether you have bought it or rented it from some AI system provider out there, you're going to have to think about it all. And the guidance also says for the AI enhanced frauds that are out there, and there are going to be a ton of those frauds, you will need to stop and think, do we still have anti-fraud controls that are up to the task? Maybe you won't. If you're a financial services firm, are you making sure that your customer due diligence controls, policies, procedures, are they able to detect AI driven false documentation, false passport images, that you could create a whole history of a person. So you're researching this customer who might look like they've not just been real right now, but they've been real for 20 years and they don't actually exist. AI could easily be used to create that sort of fictional personal history. So you need to think about all of that. Okay, so what are compliance officers, internal audit executives, anti-fraud people? What are they doing to think about what those risks are? There's a lot of risk assessment questions you need to start to think about. Who's going to be involved at what point? You could say that, let's say you're developing a new AI system that you might sell to somebody else. You're developing a pricing or customer recommendation, product recommendation tool. How are you making sure at the developer side of it, the software development of this tool, that you're building in good anti-fraud controls, that you're building in good behavioral controls? It's kind of a weird concept to think about from a technology perspective. Who would be involved in that? Imagine a compliance officer involved in software development processes. Typically, that would not happen. But if you're now using AI that essentially you're going to build it and design it and offer it to act like a person, compliance officers are involved in governing how people act all the time. How would compliance officers be involved in the software development of an artificial person, an artificial intelligence? And the last point that I want to raise is, like I said, this second speech from Miss Argentieri, who is the head of the criminal division. She spoke earlier this week at a cybersecurity and crime conference where they talked specifically about something like bug bounty programs. These are not new ideas in software development. You come up with a software product and people might take it and test it and find bugs in it. And for a long time, software companies would say, don't do that. You can't find bugs in my program. I don't want people to know that they could hack into it. That had changed over time. So now eventually you hear about in the news that Microsoft Windows or Java or some other big program, Oracle, SAP, there'll be a new bug out there and they will publicize it and publish a patch for it so you can seal it up. Argentieri expressly said companies should be thinking about how to build a bug bounty program for AI. How would that work? Think about it, because yes, you need to come up with a patch program for actual errors in the code, but what about errors in how the AI behaves. That is not something a software coder would easily be able to figure out. Compliance officers would be able to see that's not a good thing the way it's behaving. That could be a compliance violation or a legal violation. How would they work with software development companies to or develop teams to think about bug bounties and or how to disclose a vulnerability that they found? And she basically said, yes, the big tech companies already do this, and they have pledged to do it. A vulnerability disclosure program for AI, that's something that Google, Facebook, Anthropic, OpenAI, they've all pledged to do that. She flat out said, other companies that are doing this that aren't yet signed on to that pledge, like the big tech companies, you should do this too. So I'm wondering if you don't do that, if you're not diligent in checking up on what the vulnerabilities are in AI systems you develop or that you're offering, would that then reflect poorly on your culture of compliance and all of this guidance that we have from the compliance side of things, where the updated compliance program guidelines say that you should be thinking about new risks? And then she went on to give this speech to computer scientists about what some of those new risk management measures should be. There's an awful lot to think about here. And I would just encourage compliance officers to think about that. Think about who else on your team you should be talking with. And we could keep going and going, but this is going to be a fact of life for corporations for the rest of our lives.
Karen Moore, do you have a question or comment for Matt?
I do. AI is such a huge topic. Sometimes it's hard to get your head around the big
Yes.
picture and the small picture, what they're calling kind of general AI, this possibility that you can create an independent artificial intelligence, which is hopefully so far in the future that I won't be around to see it, or the narrow AI, the application of a specific artificial intelligence to a task. And it's because it's just easier to get your head around and a little bit less frightening to think about narrow AI. And I've really been thinking a lot about its use by compliance teams because you go into a vendor call now at a conference and there are more and more providers that will allow you to take data, start connecting the dots, doing a lot with it. But I know, and I'm sure all of you do too, from my own experience, that it's like the garbage in, garbage out kind of issue. So it's like, how are we using AI? What are the tasks that we're setting it to, and where are the risks associated with it? Which doesn't apply just to compliance teams' use, it applies to anybody's use of that. But to the extent that the ECCP kind of instructed compliance programs to use AI commensurate with the degree to which the enterprise is using AI, right? So if the enterprise is using it in a sophisticated way, the compliance program shouldn't be those cobbler's children go barefoot kind of situation. You should be using AI as well. But it's really what tasks are we setting it to and how are we putting that framework around those tasks that doesn't actually create more risk than it is designed to solve. With data privacy, I often used the shutting the barn door after the horse is bolted analogy because the information's out there. With AI, I've started thinking it more like the genie out of the bottle, right? The genie doesn't have its own will and ability to create an objective. All you can do is give it an objective that it will fulfill. Where in a lot of these kind of fables, you see the third wish is usually undoing the first two wishes because you haven't framed them correctly. And it seems to me that when we're using AI for compliance or other purposes, what objective or what task are we setting for that artificial intelligence? And how are we framing it so that you don't, I don't know, like think of Midas trying to say, I want everything I touch to turn to gold. And he ended up destroying his family and himself. So you have to put all these qualifications. Like I'd like to become wealthy, not to the at the expense of my family or loved ones or community. I want to engage in world peace, but not at the risk of subjugating populations. I don't know. You have to put so many qualifications around. So I guess that really is my question: is how can we, as compliance officers, direct AI in the best possible way that doesn't actually create more problems than we've intended to solve?
I think it's a great point, and a couple of thoughts. First, yes, it's true that there are some very slick and impressive use cases I've seen specifically for AI in the compliance department. Pretty much every vendor I know at this point is scrambling to figure out ways to use AI to help the compliance office do their job well. Still, can't get away from the fact I don't think that's going to be the big problem for compliance officers. I am not that worried about how they will use AI because A, they're thoughtful about what the risks are, and B, compliance is still fairly self-contained within the enterprise. I am much more worried about how will other parts of the enterprise use AI, and they're going to intersect with customers, business partners, the greater world out there. That's how the genie gets out of the enterprise. I love your metaphor about the genie out of the bottle and granting wishes because that's all it can do. I think that is spot on for the sort of challenge we're facing. But, I still get stuck on how we are at least familiar, corporations, with how to handle some technology risks because technology up until now wasn't really reaching decisions and taking actions on its own. And now AI is. So it sort of serves the role of humans, but how you govern the risks of AI as opposed to the risks of the human are going to be very different. And like I said, this vulnerability disclosure program that Nicole Argentieri from DOJ basically said, we're expecting companies to do this. How would that work? Yes, that every company making AI is going through the code to make sure there are no bugs in the code so it will behave and that it will work, that it won't crash. But how are you going to detect a vulnerability like the AI is going to pick up bad habits by interacting with people, and then it's going to start behaving in ways that it shouldn't and we didn't anticipate? You can see how a company might handle that with humans because we would be on you about training and testing, and HR people could probably come up with ways to govern discriminatory behavior and bad habits that employees might pick up. How are you supposed to do that with AI? Who's going to be HR is not going to inspect the code. Is HR going to grade their work? Does the AI get a performance review? That sounds foolish, but that's kind of what we're getting at when we talk about weaknesses in how AI behaves. And so we're going to need to think of whole new processes that will involve people not typically doing this stuff before. And that's going to be tricky. I don't think tech or intern, a lot of people would be imposed to helping out with that challenge. I just don't think it's ever occurred to anybody. That's going to be the challenge. And yeah, we're going to have to figure it out.
Yeah, as I understand it, Matt, one of the whole points about sophisticated AI and the difficulty of this explainability requirement is that there's a big black box around how the AI comes to its output. So the explainability and debugging, if you will, really are pretty impossible.
Yeah, I've said before that, look, humans have a black box too. We don't actually know how people think to reach a conclusion. But to say that you could zap or tweak a few parameters in an AI code so it'll behave differently, that's like saying if you zap 3 brain cells over here as opposed to 3 or 4 brain cells over there, I will become less sexist or more discriminatory or somehow otherwise change my ethical behavior. We have no idea if that actually could work. Doctors don't know how the brain works like that yet. And we really don't quite know how AI does it either. We're going to be stuck observing and monitoring its outputs, just like you would with any employee. How are we supposed to do that? That is the oversight and business process challenge that we have yet to figure out, but it is clearly coming quite soon. And already regulators are thinking if it's a compliance violation, it's a compliance violation, and the company needs to be responsible for it. We don't really care that it was a person or a tech that did it. It's still a violation. That's basically what these updates from the DOJ are telling us, and we're going to have to respond to it.
And I really like your approach, Matt and Karen. I love your analogies that you've put out there. And the one thing I would add is there are bread and butter compliance issues as well that really I think are going to be changed radically by the fact that if people are putting data into AI, Let's take a really mundane example. If a research scientist asks AI to help write a paper, are they putting control technology into AI? And does that then become part of the public domain? And from an export control point of view, having worked at two tech companies, I can imagine that's a real risk. And so not only sort of trying to figure out how you debug it or how you uh, deal with black box, but being able to step back and take a big look at what have we actually put into AI that is out there now. And if we put other building blocks into AI, does that mean that at some point we've given away valuable intellectual insights or property, or even violated the export control laws?
I will add that the Justice Department is aware that those are some very interesting legal questions, and they have said that they are going to update the guidance they have about vulnerability disclosure programs to try and address some of the copyright and intellectual property concerns that might arise. I also suspect that appellate judges and law professors will have a field day with this for years to come, but it doesn't change the fact that if you have a weakness in AI is going to behave fundamentally differently than a weakness in a spreadsheet program that you release. But I also see that Jonathan Marks is foaming at the mouth to challenge it. So I'll shut up from here.
No, I'm not going to challenge you. I'm going to enhance this because you all said such great things. But again, I like to break things down and unpack them. This is model validation 101. It's the sources of truth. You have to take, Susan, you're absolutely right. Everything that goes into that black box is a source of truth. It's document. You have to document the process. AI assembles all of this stuff and is formulating some form of logic. You can't take the human out of the loop. But years ago, we were developing transactional screening and cybersecurity screening for all these alerts. I came up with this funnel concept whereby data goes in the top of the funnel, and at certain points and layers in the funnel, you have certain programs that are interrogating that data and giving you better input. At the end of the day, what you're doing is you're creating this artificial intelligence. It was in its rudimentary form, but at the end of the day, when that output comes out, there has to be some human that looks at this for certain parameters and says, does this all make sense? That's the other black box. So to me, everything that you all said completely conforms, but it's no different than model validation. It's taking that black box, looking at these sources of truth, and figuring out where they go. Companies are going to have to inventory all this stuff and show me what's going in there and how it's going in there. It could be a spreadsheet. It could be something from Oracle or SAP. It all has to go in there. And at the end of the day, you take this giant ball of spaghetti and you start to untangle it in a way that if somebody came in and said you were doing X and Y, you say, hey, that's great. We know it's not perfect, but here's our process. Here's what we went through. These are our sources of truth that we know are valid and we can validate them. So from an internal audit perspective, Matt, internal auditors can certainly help out here by going and saying, okay, fine, show me what's going into this so that we can understand at the end of the day and have some confidence that what's coming out of it at least has the right sources of truth. And that's the process that has to be gone through in order to document all this. I think that's what they're getting at because it's no different to me than transactional screening and this concept that we call model validation. AI is a model and it needs to be validated. And if you're a company that's using it and you're pulling things in from wherever you're pulling from, you better make sure that those sources of truth are valid, complete, and accurate and genuine.
I think on that note, we're actually going to move to you, Mr. Marks, because I asked you to look at continuous control monitoring, which is something that you and I have been talking about for literally years. Do you see anything new and different in the 2024 update, or is it sort of business as usual from your perspective?
Nope, it's different. I think the big thing that we all get a deep breath on and come back on is it needs to go back to really what is continuous monitoring and what is continuous auditing, because they're not the same. And a lot of folks, again, don't understand continuous monitoring is a management-led process that involves real-time oversight of business processes operations and transactions. So if you look at the ECCP in 2024, they not only talk about compliance, but they talk about operations in general, because this all kind of comes into to the to the big picture here. And the goal of continuous monitoring is to ensure the controls are functioning as intended, so as they're designed. So again, little SOX reference there: design and effectiveness. Are they designed appropriately? And that organizations are compliant with its policies and regulations on a day-to-day basis. That's really what it's saying. So CM focuses on operational activities such as financial transactions, which we know, compliance with regulatory obligations, which I just mentioned, vendor performance, and the like. It's about identifying anomalies and irregularities in real time so that management can take immediate and corrective action. That's the feedback loop. They're telling you that they want a better feedback loop. It's just not word of mouth anymore. It's just not people filing complaints or issues via the ethics hotline. It's they want the data to talk. Data sings and it tells you something. And that's really what they're looking for. They're saying, hey, take your data, use that as an advantage here, use that feedback. You need to unpack what the data is telling you and make, there may be risks that are identified that you hadn't identified before. There may be control failures that you have identified. There may be operational efficiencies or breakdowns that can eventually hurt you from an overall compliance perspective that may have nothing to do with financial performance. For example, inventory turnover. Again, I'm just making up a hypothetical here, but if you look at inventory turnover as sort of one of those key metrics, and you have, let's just say, ice cream in a freezer that's been in there for 180 days or more, and maybe there's some health risk related to that, that may not have a financial impact directly, but it could at the end of the day. And so there's all these other things that are out there that I think we're moving more towards this enterprise risk resilient ecosystem. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for break down those three lines and those silos into that the entire organization is functioning and communicating. So that's, when I read it, that's kind of the message that I was getting out of this. And I'm trying to figure out ways now to unpack that even a little bit more so that I could provide appropriate guidance to our clients. But that's kind of what I'm getting out of it. And the whole concept of continuous auditing, that's really led by internal audit. And so that's, again, and it functions, it does use technology and automated tools to audit on a sort of a continuous basis, but not led by management. So you have, if you look at the ecosystem, you do have management and there has to be accountability there. And then you do have audit as part of the overall ecosystem process. You also have legal and complaints that are in there as well, but it's really working across all of those lines together and as a complete and total unit, I think more towards getting to this enterprise risk resilient ecosystem.
Karen Moore, what did you see looking at the 2024 ECCP around whistleblowers? Or did you just, from the Argentaria speech where she talked about the whistleblower incentive program from the DOJ, do we see anything new in either of those?
Yeah, I think we see some change in emphasis. And I really liked Susan's comments that a lot of these changes are driven by frustrations within the criminal division in terms of what they're seeing or not seeing. So maybe some clarifications, maybe one item of jealousy I'll point to. But I think these revisions go hand in hand with the August whistleblower program and then the earlier voluntary self-disclosure program. And we're kind of seeing this whole network now within the DOJ of how to get people to let the DOJ know what's going on so that they can do something about it. But the first thing that occurred to me with the changes is this emphasis on how does the company assess an employee's willingness to report misconduct? Because I think that's one of the big challenges every compliance officer has. You don't need it in writing, but it's kind of nice to have. For me, it's really trying to get to the root of the matter. If we count on our employees to be one of the critical sources of information about misconduct in the organization, then we need to find out why they report, the incentive part of it, which I think is the harder part, or why they don't report, which isn't. I'm a big believer in surveys, whether they're a standalone compliance and integrity survey or whether they're attached to a employee engagement survey or whether they're just sent out by SurveyMonkey, one way or the other. I find it really valuable to collect some data through a series of questions. Did you see something that might be a compliance violation? If you saw something, did you report it? If you reported it, where did you report it? If you didn't report it, why didn't you report it? Right. And that starts to give you two really important gaps that really would respond to some of these changes to the ECCP. The first gap are the things that are reported, but they're not in your system. So if you have 500 employees saying, yeah, I reported misconduct, and you only have 50 cases in your system, you've got a really big gap there. And it's true that some things maybe weren't compliance issues, some things were multiple reporting. So it's not an absolute truth, but if there's a big gap there, and there always is, it's a question of where are things getting stuck. For me, it's almost always I reported to my manager never got it to compliance. Now, maybe manager handled this really beautifully and you don't need to worry so much, but you're missing the data that's going to allow you to do some trend tracking, that's going to allow you to do some complicated assessment of what's going on in the organization. But okay, it at least got handled well. I fear that more often than not, we tell people, please report to your manager, and then the manager isn't equipped to handle the report in a way that is consistent with company commitments, or maybe the manager becomes part of the problem. So that's gap number one, I think, that really needs to be assessed. It can also identify problems with your helpline, by the way, because I think a lot of people drop out halfway through the reporting process. They may consider they made a report, but they didn't in the end, or maybe your helpline data isn't really doing what it needs to do. So that's another contributor there. The second gap that I think is really important is the ratio between what people say they observed and is not reported at all. And there, the next series of questions has to be why. And we get the kind of common breakout, and you see it in a lot of really useful studies that have been done by different service providers on this. So you've got a lot of global data out there. You get it's not my job to report. I didn't know it was a compliance violation. I wasn't sure how to report. I didn't want to get someone else into trouble, which I always pre-compliance thought was going to be the number one, and doesn't tend to be the number one. And the one that tends to be number one, which is I fear retaliation. And then you can start to break that down and address those problems. Are your policies clear? Are your reporting channels clear? Is your process clear, et cetera? And it gets us to another really big new addition to the ECCP here, which is this commitment to whistleblower protection and anti-retaliation. And it almost seems odd that for the first time they're focusing on retaliation, because it's a big driver for not reporting, and it's a big driver for future reporting as well. So having a robust anti-retaliation policy is not enough. You need a program, you need a process. I think this is a place where AI can come in to interact with HR systems, for example, because being able to track what happens to a whistleblower over time in terms of their career, I think, is one important component. Then there's the kind of personal interaction. So having this kind of anti-retaliation program, not just we have zero tolerance for retaliation in any form, it's just not enough. You can't guarantee it. I always have a real problem with zero tolerance, because it's a bar that's almost impossible to meet. But a lot of the retaliation is soft retaliation. I teach skiing on the weekends in the winter at our little local resort, and I'm in a lineup with a lot of guys that are macho ski instructors. I hear so many inappropriate comments that violate the corporation that purchased our small little resort, violate the code of conduct, violate their anti-discrimination policies, create a hostile work environment. Would I report any of that? Absolutely not. I got to stand next to these guys every day. And when I did finally report something slightly unrelated, the anti-retaliation kind of corporate response was to wrap me in bubble wrap. I kept getting people calling me and checking in on me. And I was like, look, I reported, I did my job. You guys reacted, you did their job. Just leave me alone. I did what I wanted to do. So there's so much complexity on reporting even something small, and reporting something really big is hard. And then I mentioned a little bit of jealousy. I'm gonna attribute it to jealousy because I think it's just a fun thing to say. But this whole idea of training people on reporting mechanisms outside of the organization is a big question mark to me. I think there's a little bit of jealousy because the EU whistleblower directive does provide an some cases that you've got to educate people and let them know that there are external reporting mechanisms. I'm not really sure how you train somebody to say, hey, look, you can go to the SEC, you can go to the DOJ, but definitely incorporating those into your overall Speak Up program, I think is important, because the minute you don't, you go back to the earlier reporting mechanism question of, does the company have practices that chill reporting? You've got to make people aware of what's going on all over. There's so much to talk about when it comes to speaking up. I think these changes are good changes. As Susan said, they probably reflect some frustration on the part of the DOJ. They help. I don't know how much they change, maybe except the external reporting system, what compliance officers are already struggling with.
Susan, do you have a question or comment for Karen?
Yeah, Karen, I love what you said, and laying it out very comprehensively was really helpful. And just one research point at LRN, I ran the program effectiveness report every year for the last 7 years. And something I saw that was really resonating with E&C professionals was to really try to broaden the hotline into the help. It sounds kind of simple and kumbaya, but as Scott Sullivan at Mining used to say, if you can demystify the hotline and make it where you call when you say, I just have a concern, or it seems that there's a lot of pressure in this particular division, that doesn't rise to the level of the complaint. But it can be an early warning sign that something may go amiss. And I think that really helps make employees comfortable. I don't know if GE still does this, but they used to have a little icon of a mic on everybody's intranet, and you were encouraged. They called it open reporting. You could click it, it would load a message, and then it would go in. And they had a dashboard where they could triage sort of what was compliance related, what was HR, somebody ate my sandwich type stuff, and what was even sort of suggestions for how to make things better. So I think demystifying the hotline actually can really make it much more effective for people.
No, I agree so much. And we're rebranding it for one thing, so that it really is a helpline, and encouraging people to just ask questions. Like, the policy says this, I've got this situation. What does that mean for me? And we try to, in my last job, really collect examples from people. Where are you finding that the policy or the supporting documents don't answer your question? How can we help? I do think one problem, and maybe just using the GE example, is limited resources on the part of the compliance department, where if you're going to be the be all and end all for, I don't like the color green they
Yeah.
painted in the hallway, or somebody took my yogurt, first of all, you need a safe pair of hands to refer those to, right? Because now you're, kind of in the position of the caregiver. So you need to know that other people have processes in place to deal with the fact that my pay stub was inaccurate. But you also have to then deal with it and then know whether they've got a tracking system. So I got so many times in different organizations, oh, can we expand the helpline to cover this, that, and the other thing, including third party complaints, right? Third parties have concerns that are not just compliance concerns, but they're contract related. And you just start to think, where are my resources to start addressing these and getting them into the right hands? But I agree 100%.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are on to fan favorites, shout outs, and rants. Susan, we're going to let you go last so you hear what everybody does. And I'm going to take the leadoff spot. Then to Matt, then to Karen, then to Jonathan, and Susan. You'll bat fifth today. I'm going to shout out to Judge Matthew Barrett. He is the judge in Colorado who sentenced Tina Peters to 9 years in prison for election tampering. This was one of the great sentencing hearings of all time. Ms. Peters said, I'm not a criminal and I don't deserve to go to prison where other people committed heinous crimes. She then went on a muddled tangent about how the district attorney who filed the charges against her was implicated in a plot to get her ailing husband to divorce her. Judge Barnett responded, you are no hero. You're a charlatan who used and is using your prior position in office to peddle a snake oil that's been proven junk time and time again. But here's the money line for some people on this podcast. He also said, at the end of the day, you cared about the Jets, the podcast, and the people fawning over you. For those listening, you know who you are. Matt, what you got for us?
Tom, I am going to stick with the judicial branch of society, but I have a rant. I am going to complain about Judge Catherine Kimball Mizell. She is a district court judge in the Central District of Florida, which I believe is Tampa. Judge Mizell recently ruled that PTAM whistleblowers under the False Claims Act, that's unconstitutional. And she threw a case out. Never mind that the False Claims Act is nearly 200 years old. It was signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln. That qui tam lawsuits, which of course are when a whistleblower brings a lawsuit over fraud against the government on behalf of the government. Sometimes the government then joins those lawsuits. Sometimes it does not. But whistleblowers can bring a lawsuit under the False Claims Act looking to claim that some government contractor has overcharged the federal government. And Judge Mizell said, nope, can't do that. That is unconstitutional because qui tam whistleblowers filing lawsuits are self-appointed special prosecutors, quote unquote, and prosecution only rests with the executive branch. So qui tam whistleblowers cannot exist. This is not a thing. The Supreme Court itself has already decided that, yes, the False Claims Act is constitutional. Yes, qui tam whistleblowers are allowed. Every other judge in the country who has ever considered this has also said, yes, qui tam whistleblowers are allowed and perfectly fine. But Judge Mizell, who is all of 37 years old, who has virtually no legal experience, and who was therefore, of course, appointed by Donald Trump, who had a long history of appointing unqualified judges, she just took it upon herself to say, no, I disagree, and create this big mess. This is ridiculous. This is yet another example of these unqualified Trump judges making these off the wall legal decisions that have no resemblance to reality, have no respect for precedent, and fly against even the standard that Clarence Thomas has spelled out that a law should only be constitutional if it is in comportment with the nation's traditions and history. And like, guys, this law is nearly 200 years old. This is clearly in comportment with the nation's values and histories and traditions, but it doesn't fit what the Trumpist legal theory, the legal world now likes, which is to complain about special prosecutors, which is really what this is about. That's it. That she, very much in the mold of a fellow unqualified Trump judge who is down in Florida, Judge Aileen Cannon, also ruled that special prosecutors are unconstitutional, even though every other judge and every other appellate court that has considered it has already said, yes, they are. But we just have this infection of unqualified judges that Donald Trump stuffed into the federal judiciary. Judge Mizell, in particular, was all of 33 when she made it onto the federal judiciary. She had been an associate at Jones Day Law Firm, had clerked a couple of times, including for Clarence Thomas, cited one of his dissenting opinions as evidence that, therefore, I should say special prosecutors are kind of like qui tam whistleblowers, so therefore should be illegal. Enough with these off-the-wall judges making these off-the-wall rulings and screwing it up for everybody else. And Judge Mizell is very much in that mold. So that's my tangent, that's my rant, and I am done.
What do you have for us, Karen?
I've got a Happy New Year wish to everyone and a relationship of the Jewish holiday of Rosh Hashanah to our compliance work and everything compliance. So on Tuesday evening, Jews around the world celebrated the start of a new year, a year 5785, which is supposed to measure the beginning of creation. Just as an aside, I went as part of my confirmation class, we visited an ultra-Orthodox Hasidic community, and we had a chance to meet students and talk to the rabbi. My mom, by the way, sent me with a ham sandwich. That's how Reformism we are. But in any event, the rabbi was asking if we can measure the world to creation, how do you explain the fact that geologists can carbon date rocks to millions of years ago? And the rabbi, without missing a beat, said, if God could create an entire world in 6 days, you think he couldn't create a few million-year-old rocks while he was doing it? I like that because I think that for all of us, it's always trying to reconcile the facts we have at hand. But the kind of sad part about Tuesday night when I entered our synagogue is not only did I have to pass through a metal detector and a number of very wonderful police officers who were wearing bulletproof vests, but the head rabbi started off the service by saying, "Look, there are people around here with orange lanyards. If you see something, please say something. If you're concerned about your own security, please make sure you connect with one of them," which says a little bit about the state of the world. But Rosh Hashanah does kick off what we call the days of awe. It's the beginning of the year. It's a time for reflection. It's your chance to make good what might have gone wrong. And for all of us compliance officers, I think the obligation imposed by the concept of tikkun olam, that is to repair the world, is something, especially in this world, in this day and age, we all take on our shoulders. So I wish everybody, Jewish or not, a sweet and wonderful, safe, prosperous, healthy new year. And let's continue our work to repair the world.
Mr. Marks, what do you have for us today?
Yes, I'll echo Karen's sentiments on Shana Tova to all of my friends and family that are out there. Happy New Year. May it be a peaceful one, a healthy one, and a blessed one for everybody. My shout out is I have a shout out and a rant quickly. Shout out to the Philadelphia Phillies for making it into the playoffs and wishing them good luck tomorrow night. Pick your favorite team. Hopefully they go far too. My wish is that Tom and I are sitting in the bleachers in Citizens Bank Park in several weeks. You will hit Tom with his Astros hat on and mine with my Phillies hat on, watching our two teams play. My rant is TSA. I do not know how this earth that we live on, that a guy sitting back in a chair watching what appears to be an X-ray image of these bags rolling in at hundreds of miles an hour can know if there's anything that's detrimental in in your luggage or whatever that you're packing. I watched this the other day in amazement as to how sometimes the individual is attentive and sometimes the individual is not. And these things keep rolling through only to be followed by a very nice gentleman who was a paraplegic in a wheelchair being patted down and screamed for more than 35 minutes. So I don't get it. I don't understand it. It seems to be broken. It has to be fixed. I don't know how it's protecting any of us. Maybe it isn't, but it just seems to be broken all over the place.
Susan, you have our honored spot to end shout outs and rants. What do you have for us?
First, I'm going to say one thing to Jonathan, which is there's this thing called technology, Jonathan, and SAIC, where I used to work, kind of made a lot of those machines. And it's really not up to the guy or to sort of say, oh, that's a banana and not a gun or whatever it happens to be. Some of those machines can actually read the DNA signature of what's in there, which is really pretty cool when you think about it. So anyway, I'll let you off the hook. My rant, it's not a rant, it's a joyous shout out to a really momentous thing, which is that I've lived in Washington really since the 70s when before a lot of people were born on this call and all. And finally, the football team has hope again because I went through Sonny Jurgensen and Joe Gibbs and Riggins and all that. And then it's been a long, long dry spell. And finally, they changed their name. Finally, they got rid of the really toxic owner. I like your comment, Tom. And now we have a team. And the quarterback, Jaden Daniels, was just named NFL Rookie of the Month. So there's hope. Things can be really bad, but things can also sort of turn around. So I'm really excited to be watching football again and maybe, in fact, have a winning team. And I think they're 3 and I think they're 4-2 right now. So it might work out. You never know.
Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a great episode. I want to give a special shout out to our guest panelist, Susan Divers. Susan, thank you so much. I hope you will consider joining us again. Guys, I can't wait till next time.
Thanks, Tom. It was a pleasure. It was nice to be with